Well, good morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Um, I would like to do a lesson today, something a little different, something very personal on my side. Um, it's a book that I treasure very much in my life called Reaching Out by Henry Nouwen. Reaching Out, Henry Nouwen. And it's been a pivotal book in my spiritual life. And what it shares has had the deepest change in my spiritual journey, my dependence on God. And I like to illustrate that and let you share with you a very personal story about my life, and my wife knows about this. But it's a milestone in my spiritual life when I returned after a year of deployment in Afghanistan, and I was a senior chaplain there, and I was over the whole country, actually, the theater they call it, and I supervised chaplains from about 15 different countries, about 350 of them actually, of all variety of faiths. And if you try to manage 350 clergy with different faiths, that's stressful within itself, and it was unbelievable. But it was a stressful, draining time for me, more than I've ever had in my life. We had over 200 casualties while during that period of time, and I performed memorial ceremonies for over 150 of them myself personally. And that within itself is very draining. Trying to go through this emotional time of this tragedy and all the people around that were hurting and painful. I mean, the whole large military uh, army there was just devastated by these deaths. And it was such a sad time as I watched these warriors, these hard warriors, carrying the container of one of their brothers or sisters up into the back of the plane, where I led them up into the plane. And as they placed it down with the flag draped over it, they would all kneel down and put their hands on the container and cry like babies because that was one of their teammates, their brother or sister. And I did, like I said, so many of these. And even the Air Force crew of the plane would stand in the back of the plane as tradition, and they stood there in respect and awe. And I watched them, even though they didn't know this soldier who had died, I watched them start to weep as they saw the emotion and the tragedy and the loss of these people. And I did so many of these and so many countless um, counselings about marriages breaking up and about family members that had died while they were deployed and unbelievable things like that in their life where they were hurting and they were loss of hope. They were fearful of dying or fearful of other things happening in their life and their lives were just falling apart. So they always look for chaplains for answers because I was a senior chaplain. I got so many of them coming to see me. When I first arrived in country, giving an example, we had a very large helicopter that was like a taxi service between bases. It was a Chinook, if you ever heard that term before. And so this Chinook, one of them, this is just after we got there, was lifting off one evening from one base, and there was a sandstorm coming in. They thought they could get ahead of it. Well, in their attempt to fly over the sandstorm, the aircraft lost control and it crashed. And over 30 of those soldiers and civilians that were inside that airplane died instantly. And I knew several of them personally. Two of them, for example, one was my neighbor in regard to uh, he had a wife and three kids. And so my wife knew his wife really well, but he was on that plane, an aircraft, and died. There was a young lady, a sergeant, and she had asked me to perform her marriage ceremony when we got back and we deployed back, and she was on that plane and died as well. It just shook the whole command up. And as I had to deal with that kind of thing, that's just a draining moment. So when I finally got through and redeployed back home, we lived in Italy at the time. Um, my family had already moved on and moved back to the United States for some medical reasons. And so when I got off the plane, I was by myself. And if anybody needed to have someone, it was that time for me, but I didn't have anybody and they couldn't be there for all the right reasons. So I came off and I got off the bus and then I moved into an apartment they had for me nearby. And that's where I lived the next 3 or 4 months as I started out processing and getting ready to move back to the United States to my next assignment. But sitting there alone in that apartment was just a horrible time for me when I first got there. The long year and the spiritual drain hit me so hard. I had no one to talk to. I was by myself, literally by myself, with no friends or anybody to talk to the chaplain who had problems as well. I couldn't pray. I just couldn't. I knew I needed God, but I didn't know how to talk to Him. I just didn't have anything left in me to talk to Him. All I could do was just hang my head and let the tears flow. And that's all I could do in this time. One day I was sitting there. I knew I had to do something because I couldn't live that way much longer. And I looked at one of the boxes of books that I had kept there, I guess, in my belongings. And I looked down, and this book, Reaching Out by Nouwen, was lying there. And I had used it before. It had been such a great impact in my life. I said, well, maybe I can just pick this book up and let God talk to me as I read it. And I did. And I'll tell you what, reading this and the words that came out was like water to dry sand. I just soaked it in. I needed to, because I was dry inside. As I started rereading it again, I could hear slowly and quietly God's voice talking to me and pointing things out in the book to me to take me to the right place where I can start to heal up and to start feeling like I had a direction to go and that this was all for a purpose of what I had gone through. And the hurt and the pain was still there, but I was able to handle it better, allowing me to see God in a much more intimate way than I've ever seen Him before, because that's all I needed was God. Something greater than what was around me was inside of me, something that's bigger than that. And so that's what I turned toward. So allow me for the next couple Sundays to share this book with you that's meant so much to me. And I'll talk more about this a little more, but just to show what it means to me in my life. Because I think that the message here is the kind of message that you can use as well in your life. And hopefully you can, as a message of love and hope and affirmation that God has for you in the hardest times. So there's a three-part to this book for living the Christian spiritual life and achieving that ultimate goal of life of union with God. That's what it's all about. So he asked a question in the book: how can we live a life in the spirit of Jesus Christ? How? Well, he points out that spirituality and our growth in it is an ascent. We go up, evolving our life into three movements as we go and yearn for God and try to ascend to God and be the life of Christ. Well, the first one is called loneliness to solitude, and we'll talk about that today. And this focuses in on the spiritual life as it relates to the experience of ourself. The second movement that we'll talk about next Sunday will be from hostility to hospitality, and this deals with our spiritual life with others. And the third and final movement is from illusion to prayer, which offers this penetrating thoughts on the most mysterious relationship of all, and that's our inner struggles and hostilities. And the more fully and sensitively we will be able to embrace our prayerful and genuine spiritual life as it opened, as well the needs for others. So we go from ourselves into others and into God's relationship. And these aren't just steps or levels of achievement, but like I said, a spiraling interactive movement within our lives as we strive as Christians to find that union with God. So, what is union as people with people who versus the union with God? The quest for our authentic Christian spirituality is worth the effort and the pain, since in the midst of all this quest that we all have, we can find signs of hope, courage, and confidence that we can have union with God. And these are the three steps, the three spiraling steps that get us there. Well, let's begin. Hopefully, you've got the point what I'm trying to make, and I encourage you to buy the book. if you can. Reaching Out by Nowen. It's a great book. It's not a very long one, but it's very impactful. At least it did for my life. Let's start with the first one about reaching out to our innermost self, to ourselves. And this is movement from loneliness to solitude, or as he calls it, from desert to garden. Let's talk about this suffocating loneliness that's part of our lives many times. I mean, it's by far easy to enter into this painful experience of loneliness. It's so far easy to get into. You like to stay away from it, but still it's an experience that everyone in life has at some point of loneliness, the truest loneliness. Now, you think about when you have felt lonely in your life. I mean, you might have felt it as a little child, maybe, when your classmates laughed at you because the way you looked or said something funny. Or as a teenager when you were the last one chosen for a baseball team or a date to go to the prom. You might have felt it when you were homesick being away from your family for the first time at a camp, or angry when some silly nonsense rules which you could not change just left you isolated. You might have felt it as a young adult when you went to college, where everyone talked about grades, but a good friend was hard to find. Or some kind of group or some kind of committee that you talked and gave your suggestions and no one paid attention to it. You might have felt it as a teacher if you were when you had students who didn't respond to your carefully prepared lessons or lectures, or maybe as a Sunday school teacher like myself when the group was dozing, maybe like you are doing right now, when you could feel lonely like that moment. And you might have felt it day after day during holidays and birthdays and anniversary moments. You felt so alone, or during those doctor appointments, or during those hours watching the weather from the window and you can't go anywhere and all you watch is just the rain coming down. Or maybe when you're reading a book and you find yourself staring off into space because the book can't hold your attention. Or in times in my life, for example, I'm watching a television show and I'm just empty and I don't know what to think about. And so I find myself watching TV when not even thinking about what I'm watching. I couldn't tell you what I was watching. And all of a sudden it was over. Or like me, when I felt so alone, everyone depending on me, but few reached out to help my pain and my loneliness when I was in Afghanistan and other times in my life. Loneliness can be the most universal source of human sufferings today. Psychiatrists and clinical psychologists speak about it as the most frequently expressed complaint and the root not only of the increasing number of suicides, but also of alcoholism, of drug use, of other symptoms like even headaches and stomach aches, back aches, where it may be. Loneliness can be the root of all that many times in a large number of traffic accidents. To point out how lonely people can be, Charles Swindoll, remember the Christian author, mentioned an ad in a Kansas newspaper and it read like this: I will listen to you talk for 30 minutes without comment for $5. That's all it said in the ad. And Swindle says, sounds like a hoax, doesn't it? But the person was serious. Did anybody call? You bet. It wasn't long before this individual was receiving 10 to 20 calls a day. The pain of loneliness was so sharp that some were willing to try anything for a half hour of companionship. Why is it that so many parties and friendly get-togethers leave us so empty and sad? We go there and we just don't enter in. We don't feel like we're part of it. We walk away feeling more lonely than we went. Maybe there was some kind of deep-seated issues going on with ourselves and other people. The relationships are hard to get for us. But it's the absence of that bonding and friendship that we yearn for. I mean, I've been to churches, visiting churches, for example, and I've walked away yearning for companionship, yearning for Christian friendships and Christian bonding of some sort, and I was totally ignored. No one asked me how I felt. Nobody asked me how I enjoyed the service, where do I live, or anything about me. I walked in and I walked out, feeling just as lonely. It can be very deep, this loneliness, and cannot be touched by some optimistic advertisement we see on TV all the time. Try this alcohol drink, try this drug, try this dating service, where it may be, or any kind of social togetherness. Doesn't substitute for it. They find their food with suspicion that no one cares and offers love without conditions, and no one place I can go without being vulnerable and being used. So the many rejections we have many times every day, a sarcastic smile, a flippant remark, or a brisk denial, or just silence around us, can be quite innocent, but hardly worth our attention. It arouses that basic fear of being totally alone, as it said in Psalm 88, in darkness as our companion left. Now, maybe you're feeling pretty lonely now by me talking about it so much. But I think we've all identified with this, or people we know we identified with this. There are friends we know. There are people we know of, our neighbor we don't know very well, or even a family member who really talks about this in their life. And it's so far easy to believe that this is true. We go to good men and women in our problems in the secret hope they'll take our burdens away from us and free us from our loneliness. And frequently, the temporary relief they offer leads to a stronger reoccurrence of the same pains when we are again by ourselves. But sometimes we meet and hear exceptional people who say, do not run, but be quiet and silent. Listen attentively to your own struggles. The answer to your question is hidden in your heart. So instead of running away from our loneliness that can come our way and trying to deny or forget it, we need to embrace it and protect it and turn it into fruitful solitude. To live a spiritual life, we must find courage to enter into the desert of loneliness, to go there intentionally, to be there on purpose, and change it by gentle and persistent efforts into a beautiful garden of solitude with our God. Loneliness is hiding an unknown beauty in our life. There's a book called Zen Flesh and Zen Bones. You might want to look it up. We find the story of such an encounter here in this story. So let me read a short part of it about what I'm talking about. Daiju, which is the character in the book, visited the master Baso in China. And Baso asked, well, what do you seek? Well, enlightenment, said Daiju. Well, you have your own treasure house. Why do you search outside? Baso asked. And Daiju inquired, well, where's my treasure house? And Baso answered, what you're asking is your treasure house. And Daiju was enlightened. Even after he urged his friends, open your own treasure house and use those treasures. Are you getting my point? Is that the treasure of this enlightenment, of insight, is already inside of us. It's not outside in other external ways. It's inside of us, where God has placed it as a great strength and courage inside of us to go through our desert of loneliness into that beautiful garden of solitude and find that joy and happiness there. And we want to be there. So that's part of getting closer to God. The real spiritual guide is not someone else necessarily only. Instead of advising us what we need to do or to whom to go to, offer us a chance possibly through of our mentors and pastors and into our own experience we need to go, and they need to help us there, those you trust, to find this solitude. And this pastor or this counselor, this good friend, makes us see that the pouring of little bits of water on dry land does not help. The water is quickly absorbed, never reaching deep into our dry soul. So we've got to go and find the living well within us. We reach deep enough into our surface of our complaints of why we're lonely, and we really look at it honestly, and we find that there's lots of falsehood there, but there's a golden center of it in which God is dwelling. In that loneliness, we take it and turn it into our garden. We cling to people, we cling to books and events, experiences and plans, finding them a dead end. Mother Teresa had a great quote. She said, "The most terrible poverty is loneliness and the feeling of being unloved." That is so true. The few times, however, that we do obey our masters and listen carefully to our restless hearts, we may start to sense that in the midst of our sadness, there is joy, that in the midst of our fears, there is peace, and that in the midst of our greediness, there is the possibility of compassion, and that indeed, in the midst of our irking loneliness, we can find the beginnings of a quiet solitude. Now, this is a very difficult task in our world where we're constantly pulled away from our innermost self and encouraged to look for answers instead of listening to questions. A lonely person wants answers here and now. Without the solitude of the heart, the intimacy of friendship, marriages, parenthood, and grandparenthood, and community life cannot be creative. It's a suffocating aura around us of responsibility and quietness that we cannot pull anything from. Relationships become needy and greedy and sticky and clinging, dependent and sentimental. Without solitude, we cannot experience others in a different from ourselves, but only people who can be used for fulfillment of ourselves. Everybody around us is to help us. Everything around us is to support us in our loneliness. Without the solitude, without the quietness of our soul, without that moment when we know ourselves so well, that we turn this moment into quiet introspective and growing in God in that moment, then we're able to take all these connections around and make them rich in our life. And how do we do that? Well, some form of isolation needs to be done. Morning, evening, midday, wherever you want to do it. Or a weekend from family. Some time in which you've got to take times to adjust yourself. The other way is respond to our world of life from moments of loneliness, but from the center of solitude. So instead of responding to our life of how alone we are physically, we're spiritually never alone if we allow God. And we center our life in God, and then all of a sudden we respond from solitude back to the world. And there's joy and happiness there. Then we have to have an inner sensitivity, which is the beginning of a spiritual life. We've got to know who we are and what we want. We've got to be honest with ourselves. Examples of a woman or man as a mother, wife, or husband, father, or grandparent. Are you sincere and true to the role by just personal choice or by relationship expectations and worldview? Are you a father, or you're a mother, or you're a grandparent, or a good friend only because you're trying to have expectations of those around you toward you? Are you there because you want to be a good role, whatever I just named, in your life? It starts from here and then goes outward from there versus out to here. Khalil Gibran, one of my favorite authors, said this: "When you part from your friend, you grieve it. For that which you love most in him or her may be clear in their absence, as the mountain to the climber is clear from the plain." Let me interpret that for you a little bit. When you are apart from your friend, when you're apart from the relationships around you, but it starts from your heart, it starts from your very soul about what your role is, who you are, and how you want to relate to them from a goodness in you, from a joy in you, from a solitude in you. Then when they are around you and they depart. There's no grief because that is what you love the most stays with you no matter what. It has been part of your very spirit. So let's kind of get it back to the root of it all. The movement from loneliness to solitude is not a movement of a growing withdrawal from away from everybody and everything because I'm so sad and I feel so crushed. But instead, it's a movement toward a deeper engagement in the very burning issues of our time. In other words, you engage the world from this solitude. The movement from loneliness to solitude can make it possible to convert slowly from our fearful reactions of we hear the news every day and all the moral issues going on, and we're not fearful anymore. We respond in a loving response that I am going to engage from this deep, quiet solitude of knowing who I am, who my God is, and that spiritual dwelling I have now in my life. We look at today's newspapers and CNN or whatever, it's not different from yesterday or even maybe tomorrow. And shouldn't our response be, as Christians, to stretch our arms into the words of Psalm 130? Let me read it for you. From the deep water I cry out for you, O Lord. O Lord, listen to me. Pay attention and my plea for mercy. O Lord, you could stand before you, but you're willing to forgive so that you might be honored. I rely on you, Lord. I rely on him with my whole being. I wait for his assuring word. I yearn for the Lord more than watchmen do for the morning. Yes, more than watchmen do for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord, for the Lord exhibits loyal love and is more than willing to deliver. He will deliver Israel from all their sins. That should be our prayer. Read that verse, that chapter 130 of Psalm, and that's what should be our words responding to the world from this solitude. So our response should be in protest out of solitude, often out of our hands, but it's not out of our hearts. Our response should be one of compassion, not self-righteousness and recluseness. Our response should be one of solidarity and pain if we reach out to those out there who are hurting from this deep, deep strength of solitude of a garden. So the movement, as we sum it up, from loneliness to solitude is not a movement of growing withdrawal from, but rather a movement toward a deeper engagement to the world. I'll just share one more quick story, and I know it's getting kind of long here, and I apologize, but I'm just so passionate for it. What happened to me during that deployment? 6 months in my deployment, and I'm in my office, and I am drained already. I am hurting so deeply. I haven't felt any encouraging words from anybody. My family tried, but they're so far away. And I was sitting there almost like numb from it. I wasn't sleeping well. I was eating out of habit and not very much. I was losing weight. And there was no enjoyment in my life, no joy whatsoever. I was sitting there and the phone rang. And a voice picked up, and it was a chaplain I knew, not very well, just knew him generally, back in Germany, because we were in Italy, Afghanistan at the time. His name was Mike. Now, Mike wasn't a very fuzzy, warm person. He was a deep Christian man, but he was kind of calloused on the outside. Everybody was kind of scared of him, actually. But I know he was a good man. But anyway, I picked up the phone, and he said he wanted to know how I was doing. Well, I was shocked. And I said, well, I'm okay, I guess. And he stopped. He said, Ray? He said, no, you're not. He said, I know. I just knew that for the last week, God has been working with me and keeps telling me, call Ray, call Ray. And that's why I'm calling. And then all of a sudden, God started speaking through him to me. And tears came to my eyes as he listened to me. And I could hear him sobbing on the other side of the phone as he empathetically cared for me and pastored me in this sense. And he said a prayer for me. It's a beautiful moment of moving from the desert of loneliness to the garden of solitude by my Lord through my friend Mike. I'll never forget that moment. And about 5 months later, when I was at the same point again, he called again and said, I don't know why I'm calling, but God says call you to see how you're doing. So there I was. To sum it up, I'm back in Italy in my apartment feeling despair and spiritual loss. I turned my loneliness, sitting in an apartment away from family who could not help me, and friends who were too busy with their own lives, and a job of a chaplain that was empty to me. And I looked again inward to a quiet time of reflection and seeking and slowly moved from a suffocating loneliness of desert to a rich garden of solitude in a conversation with God, heart to heart. So, my question to you today, where are you in this movement from the desert of loneliness to the garden of solitude? Are you quietly hearing the sweet voice of God? Or are you trying to seek other voices that are not so sweet and can meet that yearning in your heart and your soul? Are you taking the time to renew your soul? Well, I hope you enjoyed this. I appreciate you listening to my stories. Next week, we'll be looking at the second movement, from hostility to hospitality, which we deal with our spiritual life and the life of other people. May God be with you. Have a blessed week. Bye.